Hello everyone, it's Fluffy, and today we're going to be doing a MacBook Pro deep dive, specifically the new 14-inch and 16-inch, well, relatively new, that were released back on October of 2021. We are going to be exploring all of the different parts of the machine and seeing how they stack up against things in history and other laptops in the market. And we're going to be going relatively in depth in terms of what we're going to be exploring here. And so it's going to be rather long, so strap in and get something to drink, perhaps. And let me give you some context, let me give you some information about this, so that maybe if it's not a purchasing decision for you, maybe it will be mostly informative and in the context if you are buying or talking about laptops. So these laptops have a new design. And they are very polarizing, it seems like, whenever it came out. But the design is probably universally liked in a lot of ways because there are a lot of improvements from the previous MacBook Pro. And so any improvement is well accepted. And so people have generally come to like and appreciate this type of design. And so we're going to be talking about 6 different parts of the machine. We're going to cover the hardware and the silicon, the new M1 Pro and M1 Max chip. We're going to be talking about the incredible display. It needs a section all by itself. Some of the performance metrics that are going to be used in order to pitch this machine as a powerhouse, a professional powerhouse. And then peripherals like the keyboard, trackpad, the webcam, and then how it fits into the ecosystem. Because if it is a purchasing decision for you, it's not isolated as just in a laptop. There are a lot of other things to consider. And so let's get going. First thing we're going to be talking about is the actual hardware of the device itself. It is a brand new design. It has a flat, relatively squarish and boxy design layout, where previously MacBooks we're going to see did start off that way. It did start off that way and then kind of leaned into a more curved and rounded edge in order to give the appearance that it is a little bit thinner. It has a new keyboard that has a black well, as you can see, so it's black on black, and the purpose of that, as we'll explain later, is to give contrast to the keys. It has a new full height function row, and so you'll find this relatively rare in other laptops too, where the top is full-sized keys for your function row, where the touch bar is gone. We'll also talk about that here in a little bit. The fingerprint sensor is also new and improved, and you got new speakers. Trackpad remains relatively the same. It's just a little bit of a different size. You got ports coming back left and right. It's really just a beautiful design overall. And maybe if you weren't Apple biased, you would consider so too. I think this is a very, very well built and industrial looking laptop. Even on other laptops, you won't find that full height function row. And that gives it another advantage, the MacBook Pro, another advantage, and now the MacBook Air, which does also include the full height function rows of the screen being taller. And it's just a more comfortable aspect ratio to work in. So we have the 15-inch aluminum MacBook Pro, which was the original MacBook Pro that was released. And you can kind of see the similar DNA out in here. And I believe this was originally a PowerPC until it was switched into Intel. But you can see the squarish, boxy design. You can kind of see the MacBook Pro branding there on the bottom and the screen going relatively from edge to edge. Now the keyboard was a little bit different, obviously, along with laptops of that size where the keys were squished up close together. I remember had a Dell Latitude that was sort of like that. Really comfortable keyboards to type on. But as the years progressed, you would have these machines, which again still has that kind of boxy design language out. We haven't really converted into those curves yet. This is the unibody MacBook Pro, and the keyboard has been updated. Legendary keyboard with a scissor switch, power button in the corner, and really establishing that kind of Apple MacBook design language for years and years to come. And next, we have the Retina MacBook Pro, And it still adopted the unibody design cues, but has a new display where it is now a retina display. Now the pixels have become so dense that the display is incredibly sharp, and its properties are really just a fine display that really became a defining feature for the MacBook. If you bought a MacBook, you knew that you also bought a good display, where in Windows land, it is sometimes hit or miss, depending on the manufacturer. And you can kind of see the laptop also getting thinner, also taking design cues from the unibody that had preceded it. And you can kind of start to see the convergence of the curves. And Apple really leaned into this in 2016 whenever they released the new MacBook Pro, which it's old now. But the lineage of this is very interesting because in 2016, they released this MacBook Pro that had these curves, and it's especially prominent on the MacBook Air, especially the new redesign in 2018. And the MacBook Pro always has had this kind of boxy and flat edge design. It was just from another angle, the goal was to be very thin, even at the detriment of heat and a lot of energy consumption, especially with those Intel chips. But introduced the butterfly keyboard into the MacBook Pro line, introduced got rid of the function row, introduced the touch bar, and this is a really nice design industry trend that I really like. Very large and expansive trackpads. The Force Touch trackpad. The whole top is a solid state mechanism with motors that imitate a click, and of course the beautiful P3 displays that came with it. And the MacBook Pros got released in a huge range of sizes. There was a 13-inch, and there was a 15-inch, and then 2019 came along a 16-inch, which was a improved version of the 15-inch. It was slightly bigger, and it got rid of the butterfly keyboard, and it added a physical escape key, and it added the proper redesign of the arrows. And so instead of having it squished like you see on screen here, the top and bottom, they were separated. And so that was a really nice design change. Now, the hardware of the MacBook Pro 14 and 16-inch 2021 really is just robust in industry. It kind of gets rid of that notion of being as thin as possible, being as lightweight as possible, and just embraces that identity of, hey, this is the full package, and we're unapologetic about how this is just the laptop. And it's still beautiful in its own way. And really, the trade-off here, because when you design laptops, it's always a trade-off. How do you want it to look? How do you want it to function? What kind of features are important to you? So you have this sort of uneven on the x-axis, especially with the lid open. But it really is appreciated. And from this, even though it looks a lot thicker, and it is thicker than the previous 2016 MacBook Pros, it really just exemplifies the new direction Apple is taking in terms of, excuse me, in terms of what they have in mind, which is performance and proper cooling. Continuing on, the previous MacBook Pros had up to 4 Thunderbolt 3 USB-C ports. And these were very versatile ports, but it kind of forced everyone using MacBook Pros in order to transition to that USB-C lifestyle. And as great as a port USB-C is, and as great as a protocol Thunderbolt 3 is, it was very limited in the fact that the whole industry did not move with it. I would love to have, and it was even hindered even by Apple in a lot of cases. And I would love to see the industry move towards USB-C charging, which for the most part it has, but USB peripherals, USB-C everything, completely ubiquitous like the USB-A. And so you would have no need for dongles. You would have no need for adapters. And especially in the display industry, where that versatile connector really can push just an incredible amount of pixels. No one in the industry really could do it on a scale where it was affordable. Like LG had a couple, and Dell has some on its higher end, and Apple charges an arm and a leg nowadays for its USB-C monitors. But really, just the failure of the adoption in the market in 2016, which, looking back at 6 years ago at this point, really kind of hindered this. And so Apple said, wait a second. Our professionals use more ports than USB-C. If you were just a casual user, right, and you just took notes for university, or you wrote papers and made presentations for your work, you wouldn't need these necessarily. And yes, that is what the market research showed. The MacBook Air really could get away with 2 USB ports. And so, bringing back a huge array of ports to the MacBook Pro, first off, the introduction of MagSafe 3, into this new MacBook. And so the MagSafe technology has been incredible. Ever since Steve Jobs and his teams basically invented it onto the MacBook or onto the laptop, it's been adopted by the Surface lineup, by their magnetic connector, but really no one has really done it like Apple. There is a light on the top to indicate charging, and it just plugs in, it snaps in, and if you try to pull it out, it has magnetic connectors where pulling it out straight by force will not let it go, but any resistance from top or bottom or from the side, it will just pull right off and potentially save your laptop. This new MagSafe connection is really strong. And so it has much stronger magnets than the previous generation, but as a form of charging, and now it can fast charge, I believe 50% in half an hour. It's really just a welcome change so that you don't have to use USB-C and take up one of your ports in order to charge one again. Really welcome change, universally praised, even by those who have never owned an Apple laptop. This was huge. Now, there is one less Thunderbolt port than was previously available at the top end. So you see that the USB-C, there were 4 of them on the previous MacBook top end MacBook Pro, which was the MacBook Pro 16-inch. Now you have them upgraded to Thunderbolt 4, and you have 2 on one side and 1 on the other side. All Thunderbolt 4. And the same utility is there, and everybody's moving towards USB-C. It's much more widely adopted in 2022 than it was in 2016 or 2015, 2014, whenever the original MacBook, the 12-inch MacBook, was released with 1 Thunderbolt port. But it is effectively replaced, that 4th mysterious Thunderbolt port, even though we would like to have 4 of them. It's been replaced by the SD card slot, SDXC standard, and the HDMI port, which now there is more than enough room now that Apple has designed this chunky bit of a laptop and a headphone jack, of course, but that was always there. And so effectively having that HDMI and SD card built right in pretty much eliminates the need for a 4th USB-C. It pretty much, I have never probably found an instance where, yes, my ports were saturated, but I needed another Thunderbolt 4 port. And all of them have controllers and safety, very well built. I use the HDMI port all the time, SD card slot whenever I'm on a trip on a proper studio camera. I'll use that, and regularly on the regular Thunderbolt 4 port. One I'll use for charging, one I'll use for plugging in drives, and the other one I will use for miscellaneous, such as connecting to a monitor, which HDMI I'll do that much more often. But I'll saturate maybe 2 Thunderbolt ports on a regular day. And so this huge complement of ports is really admirable. And you can get the rest by on for adapters, and it's really not much of a burden to buy adapters anymore. Maybe USB-A, maybe an Ethernet adapter, and that's about it, as far as I can tell for the prosumer market. So we're glad that MagSafe is back. In terms of the keyboard, again, I had mentioned that there is finally, and actually, it wasn't like we were expecting it or anything, but the full height function row really came back because it has the physical escape key. It has that new beautiful fingerprint reader on the right there. A standard layout. Of course, you have the command, option, and control buttons right there. And the globe key, which is the function key on the very, very bottom left. When you click it, there's an emoji palette, which is handy. And I think you can remap that as well. It's just another modifier key. The caps lock is custom matte green, of course, when you press it. And the backlight is bright. It's even. It's years and years beyond pretty much any Windows laptop that I've experienced. I've experienced XPS's, Envy's, Spectre's, Lenovo's, ThinkPads, everything that you could possibly imagine. I think that Apple has them beat here in terms of brightness and control. And that getting rid of that touch bar, immaculate move. I think is incredible. And then we'll come back and talk about the actual performance of the trackpad, keyboard, and speakers here in a little bit. Of course, there is a new 1080p welcome. 1080p webcam is what I meant to say, and a 3 studio quality mics. On this was a mess of a slide. I don't know what was happening here, but there's an integration of the new 1080p webcam, where MacBooks have infamously, actually, laptops in general have had infamously bad webcams until the Surface lineup really started integrating really good webcams. But we will talk about the performance of this later. This is new on the MacBook Pro. And there's now a new 6-speaker sound system with spatial audio. And the MacBooks, of course, have had a lineage of incredible speakers, sound-defying, size-defying type of sound. And they've really come a long way, especially on all of their hardware. I think sound is really important to the core principle of what makes an Apple device. It's supposed to have good sound. And spoiler alert, it's actually incredible. We'll come back and analyze the performance of that in our performance section. And last but not least, for the industrial design, this is a look at my personal MacBook Pro. You can see the MacBook Pro embossed on the bottom edge of that laptop there. There's new feet. The feet are much more flat so that there's a lot more friction onto the ground. The glowing Apple logo has been gone since 2016, but it's much bigger on this laptop. This is my space gray 14-inch MacBook Pro with M1 Pro. And so there you have it. So the hardware is just incredible. And I think that anyone who knows anything about laptops just thinks that this really is just a feat of engineering. And there are few laptops designed like this out in the market. And of course, it is not conducive to upgradability whatsoever, which is an advantage that Windows has always had for a long time. But in terms of an integrated system, this is a really pretty looking machine. So let's move on to the silicon. There are now 2 options. So you have the M1, which is available on the 13-inch MacBook Pro, not to be confused with the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro, and the MacBook Air and Mac Mini, and now iPad Air and iPad Pro. The M1 chip was universal. So when they moved back to, and we'll analyze the history of this silicon, when they moved to Apple Silicon, it was a huge efficiency increase. And now M1 Pro and M1 Max are augmented versions of the M1 chip to where instead of an 8-core CPU, they have a 10-core CPU. Instead of a 8-core to 9-core, actually it's a 7 to 8-core GPU. Now it's enhanced by up to 16-core GPU on M1 Pro, up to 32 on the M1 Max. And the unified memory performance has been upgraded in terms of bandwidth and capacity. And that's really important because when you have all of these professional resource hogging, memory hogging applications, needing memory space as fast as possible in order to store things and quickly retrieve it, that memory bandwidth especially is really important. And so 200 gigabytes per second on the M1 Pro and 400 gigabytes per second, that's double the M1 Pro on the M1 Max up to. And that actually depends on how much memory it is, I believe, because you can have up to 64 gigabytes of unified memory all stacked out in the M1 Max, but up to 32 on the M1 Pro, where you could previously only have 16 on the M1. And so 200 gigabytes is like, I believe, 3 times at least more than the bandwidth of M1. And the advantage of unified memory is that the CPU and GPU both share that memory and the memory is on the actual system, on the chip, right? So it's an integrated system on a chip instead of having different, and we'll go over this, but instead of having different chips, it's all integrated into one. Therefore, you have this performance and efficiency gain that comes with that at the expense of upgradability and customizability. And so Apple's in-house silicon has been here for a long time. This is Johnny Saruji. This is my man, Johnny Saruji. He's a genius, and he is the head of Apple's silicon department. Pretty much anything in-house, he is the mastermind behind all the A-series chips, which was the custom silicon inside of the iPads and iPhones. And so the design, they brought a silicon company and they implemented it on the first iPad in 2010 with the A4 chip. And they've kept going, A5, A6, A7, all the way to the A12X, which I believe was in the 2019 refresh. That's the A12Z, actually. A12Z in the 2019-ish, 2020-ish refresh of the iPad Pro. And so now they've had, up to this point, when they transitioned in 2020, 10 years of silicon development. And of course, the silicon development has been improving year over year to the point where at first they weren't making their own GPUs. They were just borrowing cores from another one. But eventually they are getting deeper and deeper integration based off of ARM on this simple instruction set computing platform. So now you have cores, and then now you have the big little design, which means that there are performance cores and efficiency cores, which was pretty much the trademark of the M series processors. And so they made it for the mobile devices first, where they focused on efficiency, like a huge focus on efficiency and battery life with performance that comes packing. And so they have been up on this and beating Snapdragon, which is their competitor on the Android space, and really just refining their craft. And now they were ready to transition it over to the Mac, a huge transition. And so previously on the Mac, you would have different chips on the board for the CPU, for the memory, for the I/O, and they would have extra chips. This is the Apple T2 in this case, to perform anything else that they wanted to do that the regular CPU couldn't do. And they would buy it from Intel, and they would buy their controllers they would have their controllers on there, and in some cases the GPU from AMD. And all of this, the disadvantage of all of this is that even with this integrated design, it takes up a lot of space. It takes up a lot of heat because each of these packages are producing their own heat source, and it takes a lot of energy because you need to have all the circuitry to wire up all and bring energy to have all these chips to function. But with M1, it's all integrated onto one chip. And so you only need to provide power to this one chip, and so you can be really efficient about it. So M1, based off of the A series in iPads and iPhones, all of a sudden took this huge, massive leap designed specifically for the Mac on the TSMC 5nm process. It's a system-on-chip design, so that means that there's one chip and all of the little chips and chiplets are on there. So you have the die itself, which is where all of the cores, the GPU cores, the neural engine cores are on there. And then you have the unified memory parked right next to it, which is really a breakthrough in terms of traditional hardware computing design. Of course, if you build PCs at all, you will know that the motherboard connects everything, and you would have different chips. You would slot in your GPU, which is on a board of its own and connected through PCIe, and all that. And so you have Apple Silicon that traditionally is the way that Macs have been created, with Intel chips, before that PowerPC chips, like any other laptop in the industry. And so now you have M1, which features this really, really small system on a chip, which has everything it needs to run on it. And it has the RAM, it has the cores, it has all of the Thunderbolt controllers, all of the security measures, security enclave built right on. And so you would only have to power one chip. It takes space. Takes a little bit of space, so it's all on one package now, allowing you to build smaller, lighter machines. It's more power efficient based off of the 5nm process and on ARM, And the last advantage is that it only needs one cooling assembly in order to cool the whole thing. And so if you make a really efficient chip for your Mac, you can have the cooling system take up a lot more space with the space saved on the traditional silicon layout platform. And you don't need several cooling fans and several heat sinks in order to cool multiple heat sources. You just have this one heat source. So that's a basic rundown on the M1. And M1 featured an 8-core CPU, which I believe that 4 of those cores are high performance, so the big ones, and 4 of those cores are high efficiency. And so theoretically, I'm going to go on a rant about how I don't trust Apple numbers, and these numbers are not something from the engineering team, but something from marketing. But yes, this is the highest performance CPU that Apple themselves have ever built, because it basically scales up. It's based on the A13 chip, or the A12 chip. At this point, that's what M1 is based off of. And so you have different parts of this is the die component that we were talking about. This is the die with all that colorful component there. You have the 8-core CPU. And the way that the big little cores work is that you have the high performance cores, you have your professional apps, you have your high performance apps kick on, and they start using all of the cores. They have the high performance cores and the high efficiency cores. And then whenever you throttle back writing a Word document, browsing the internet, you don't need the energy from the high performance cores. And so you have these high efficiency cores that are lower performance but consume less power. And if you look at energy consumption versus performance on a graph, you put them on the X and Y axis, you see that at some point it takes an exponential amount of power in order to gain more performance on a linear pattern. And so that is the concept behind this big little design, is because the little design says that, hey, we have just enough performance. We actually have a significant amount of performance in this little power envelope, in this little heat envelope, and so we're just going to be operating down here, and if you need us, then you can call on us. But the high performance cores will take that surge in power and bring that expected level of performance in, and that way, that huge lineage, that huge heritage of power efficiency can be maintained. And this is the way that it is in iPhones. This is the way that it has been in iPads until they just decided to use M1 too. On there. Excuse me. Now, below the 8-core CPU, I believe is the neural engine. And so you have a 16-core neural engine. Actually, maybe 8 cores, but up to 16 cores by the looks of this graphic. And these are cores that are solely dedicated to machine learning and artificial intelligence. And so with everything being on security, and here's the paradigm, the security and machine learning paradigm that Apple has embraced. They believe privacy is a human right. That's what they believe. And so instead of pitching up machine learning operations into a cloud, into a server farm where you have the performance and the machine learning models and the algorithms, huge processing power up there, and then setting it back down for the convenience of machine learning features, they would rather just have everything done on device, which means that your information, AI or otherwise, stays on the device. So Apple never receives it. Apple never needs to receive it. Apple doesn't want to receive it. And now it can be done all locally on device. And so now that you have to process that machine learning on your own computer, that's the purpose of this neural engine right here, is that it's cores specialized for this type of task, to do matrix multiplication and normalization and distribution, any other fancy machine learning statistics and operations is done more efficiently on these cores that are specialized to do it. Where companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google, they'll send it up to their clouds where they have raw processing power and they have these special neural processors in order to do it really fast and send it down to you. Yes, Apple sacrifices speed and functionality in a lot of cases in order to process this on device, but it upholds their security and privacy paradigms. And in many cases, since the processing performance of the A series and M series chips, especially with their neural engines, are so high, it is a risk, or it is a compromise worth accepting in order to deliver the ML performance. And so you have these Apple encoding machine learning and AI into their M series and A series chips. It's significantly smaller than the A series chips, but also providing a platform with Core ML into the software platform. And so you have all these developers taking advantage of it and being able to train their machine learning models. And all of that on device, never leaves your computer. And to the right of the 8-core CPU, now we're talking about the basic M1 that's found in 13-inch MacBook Pro, the previous version of it. Now there's an M2. Actually, I made this before the M2 came out, but and the 999 MacBook Air that was based on the 2018 design. Now you have this is, I believe, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think it's an 8-core GPU as well. And so where you would have a 4 or 5 core GPU on the A series, on the latest A series, you have 8 GPU cores that Apple has learned to make. So remember, they used other ARM designing GPUs at first, and then they transitioned to their own and made it better over the generations in the A series. And now they've decided that the performance is enough for their GPU. And so traditionally, especially for Intel ones, the integrated processing unit has traditionally been incredibly weak, and you couldn't play games on it. It had the bare minimum, just enough to drive your display. And so if you are a PC builder, a PC enthusiast, obviously you have CPUs. If you're on Intel, it's the F series, and if you're on AMD, pretty much any affordable AMD Ryzen chip doesn't even have a GPU on it, or a GPU, an integrated GPU on the actual CPU. And so you need to buy a GPU in order to output a display. But with the focus on efficiency, M1 has this built-in and integrated, and it's actually high performance, very high performance, and it's baked. These GPU cores are baked into the software in a way that other competitors don't have an advantage for. So there are hardware subroutines and system calls straight to the GPU that optimize in apps like Final Cut Pro, like Logic, like DaVinci Resolve, Microsoft Word even, into the system. And so that's just another great thing about macOS. And the bottom left or the bottom right quadrant has things like your security chip, right? And so you have, I believe it's based off of the T2 as well, but it's an Apple designed chip in order to encode everything, in order to encrypt everything, and you have your display driver down here and things of that sort, and all of the proprietary Apple technologies integrated onto that bottom right portion there. And of course, this isn't actually what the die looks like. This is just a physical fancy marketing representation. The die shot actually looks more like that. And coming back on there, and the GPU it's in the general location. It is nested. You can see those big complexes, sort of, but it's not to scale. And you have all of the operations happening on this one chip. And so I believe we've gone on about M1 long enough. Let's move on to the improved version, the improved silicon that we find on these MacBook Pros. So, where previously the unified memory was only up to 16 gigabytes, you have the M1 Pro and M1 Max specifically, bumping it up to 64 gigabytes. And that unified memory, really, the memory usage in macOS especially, is very, very important, especially if you're video editing, if you're 3D rendering, if you are coding. You take up a lot of professional work tasks, takes up a lot of memory real fast. And so you have up to 32 on the M1 Pro and up to 64 on the M1 Max, along with improved memory bandwidth, so that you can get that not only get the information on memory back onto your cache faster, but also with again, bandwidth suggesting that there's just more of it. So, with the M1 Pro, instead of 8 cores, you have up to 10 cores. Now, I think mine is indeed an 8-core variant of that. So that means that there's an 8-core variant. But in both of these cases, they're only up to 10 cores, but 8 of these cores are high performance cores. 8 of these cores are high performance cores. So with the new chassis, with the new upgraded chassis and hardware design, you can have the cooling capacity for 8 performance cores instead of 4 performance cores and only 2 high efficiency cores. With the M1 Max, you have up to a 32 core GPU. And that is a huge upgrade from the 8-core GPU. That is 4 times more GPU cores than on the traditional M1. And 16 cores is a nice bump up, 2 times more GPU cores, up to 4 times GPU cores. I believe mine is a 14-core variant. And so that comes down to binning and everything. And then the 16-core neural engine along with it. And I might have misspoken whenever I counted the 1, 2, 3, 4. I believe that's 16 on the neural engine. And so the neural engine is the same in that case. let me double check this. Again, still built on TSMC 5 nanometer. So yes. And in terms of performance, it really is, it scales pretty linearly. And so yes, there's a 16-core architecture, 11 trillion operations per second, 15 times faster machine learning performance than when on Intel. And so you have a nice bump up. You have more cores, you have more GPU cores, you have slightly more CPU cores that are more high performance, and you have more technologies like a video encoder. That's why these chips are physically bigger than the M1. And you have all these technologies crammed down because you have more cooling capacity. There's a fan, there's a larger heat sink, and we're going to see how the whole system is cooled here in a little bit. But more technologies that were actually not physically available on the M1 chip. Like, for example, the display drivers allows you to push, I believe it's 3 6K monitors and 1 4K TV all at once on the top end, where previously M1 could only push 1, maybe 2 displays, while still remaining almost just as efficient. Of course, it can't be as efficient because it doesn't have as many efficiency cores, but with similar efficiency because it's built on a similar technology, right? All right, and it has a video decoder, which I talked about, ProRes video encoders and decoders that are special cores that accelerate the performance of ProRes. And actually, I've edited in ProRes. If you have the new iPhone, then you can shoot ProRes, and the MacBook Pros just slice through it like butter. So, with the improved silicon, means more energy and more heat. And so you have a bigger fan than compared to the previous MacBook Pros. You have a thicker chassis, so that means you have more cooling capacity, you have bigger heat sinks, which that is the case in this case. And so you have 2 fans that take in cool air from that middle part, swirl it around, and kick it right back out the heat. This is really an efficient way of cooling that heat, especially with the M1 processor or M1 Pro or M1 Max processor in the middle there. And then you can see the battery array here. This is actually a really nice layout. You can see the board and all of the controllers and circuit regulators on the board, the Wi-Fi antenna up on the top there. And then you have that one heat generating source, main heat generating source. Of course, the batteries there also generate heat, but in their own way. And then you have the 2 speakers out on the side. And so what does that translate to in performance, in terms of performance? Okay. In terms of number performance, they are touting 70% less power on a similar 8-core PC laptop chip, and in this case, they are comparing it to the MSI Prestige 14 Evo, and higher relative performance on the M1. Now, as a person who has studied statistics extensively in undergraduate, in order to learn AI, algorithms, and machine learning, a lot of this bothers me because you have power consumption in watts, right? In physical watts. And then you have the relative performance, whatever that means, relative performance units. That is nowhere near enough information to provide the context that M1 really, or M1 Pro really is just this breakthrough chip. Now, in raw terms, giving to me empirically, I can see that this is really going to be bound to be more efficient, and the CPU and GPU performance is really bound to have more power per watt, which is the metric that Apple cares most about. But Apple has set up these charts in a way that really there is one metric that they want to spin out of this. And in this case, that metric is a 70% less power for the same performance and extended performance up on power consumption, where, we are at less than half of the performance, yet we're outperforming them in terms of relative performance. What does relative performance mean? What does it mean when you have relative performance units? Is it Cinebench? Is it Geekbench? Is it some app that performs well in a Mac favor? And of course, sometimes marketing can't help themselves in creating charts like this because it looks pretty. It gets that central message out there and in small text. Actually, I misspoke. The 4-core PC was the MSI Prestige 14 EVO, which is a 14-inch laptop. Pretty good in its own respect. And 8-core PC performance data is from the another MSI. That's actually a model that I'm not familiar with, and I don't know how that operates. But CPU versus performance power here, you can see that in general, yes, it actually exceeds M1 in terms of the ability to consume more power and have much more power for professional applications. And it is beating previous generation PC laptop chips with Intel or AMD. It's actually, the performance gap has gotten a lot closer now that Intel had their own big little implementation, so they do have high performance and high efficiency cores. But you can see that at this point in time, the M1 is touting a lot more performance. And take this graph for what it will, but it is trying to tell a story, and that is the narrative that we are working with right now. And in terms of GPU performance, now this is actually pretty big because there is a grain of truth. And if you're looking at this graph here and you're saying, okay, man, power consumption versus relative performance, with no context, with zero context about how they tested this, and having drawn their own conclusions, you can see that, hey, we're trying to tell you that there's 100% less power, but in terms of relative performance, we're crushing them in every way. But this graph actually was the first one, I believe, that I've ever seen where the high-end PC laptop graphics actually beats out the M1 GPU. And so 100% 100 watts less power, that's actually a significant amount of less power, comes at about maybe 375 relative performance units, whatever that means. And then compared to, this is a Razer Blade 15 Advanced, which of course has cooling problems of its own and consumption powers of its own. I'd rather much test something else that's not a Razer Blade because they have very Apple-like design language or design philosophies. But this, the Compact Pro PC laptop performance chip was done on this Razer Blade 15, I believe it's 3080 mobile, is actually beating out nearing 400, 390, 400 relative performance units, whatever that means. But efficiency is the key. And even though you have these high-end laptop chips, NVIDIA are running circles. M1 Max, the 16-core or 32-core GPU, which is actually quite a lot, not even competitive with 3080. 3080 is pushing out frames per second and high-end performance out the nose, but at the expense of heat and power. And so Apple is emphasizing that efficiency is the key here. M1 Max, efficiency is the key, 100% watt less power for similar performance. That's what they want to take out of this. And so if we take them at their word, yes, especially M1 Max, which gets hotter, obviously, because it has more performance, it does really have a lot more power in terms of your power consumption in relative in comparison to your power consumption. And so you have your efficiency there, and it's beating out integrated graphics any day of the week. So next we move on to the display. And the reason the display gets its own segment is because I have never seen anything like this on many other laptops. And so you have that MSI laptop, I think it was a Radeon laptop that came out with mini LED. And it was incredibly bright, it was incredibly good, it was a matte display. But Apple likes to make their display glossy, and so you have custom display technologies being put into this MacBook Pro. The lid, fun trivia fact, is now thicker than previous any MacBook in order to just house all of these new technologies. And so you have your mini LEDs, thousands of them grouped into individually controlled local dimming zones for really, first of all, it's contrast, right? So you have really high brightness in one area and really low brightness in another. And brightness control up to something like 1600 nits. This is an XDR display. And then you have your optical film and diffusers and the actual display itself, the front of the display itself, really just makes into an incredible experience. And let me just spoil it right off the bat, say that it is crazy bright, crazy color accurate. It's not by any means calibrated in terms of contrasty, punchy color, right? So very saturated look. It's very neutral and a great display, as is expected of the MacBook Pro line at this case. And so there are two sizes that are dictated by the size of the chassis. There's a 16.2 inch one that is really huge, and a 14.2 inch one, which is the one I have. Of course, the 16.2 has considerably more pixels, about 2-3 million more pixels. But the measure of this display, in my opinion, is brightness and pixels per inch. So the brightness is plenty. It can peak up to 1600 and is on the regular 1200 bright. And brightness is on a logarithmic scale. And so maybe it doesn't mean much that it's 1600 in terms of brightness, but plenty bright enough to use outdoors in most occasions, and plenty bright indoors. It is the pixel per inch, the pixel density resolution, 254 ppi. That target resolution is enough to have display scaling on macOS. The text looks incredibly sharp. The colors look incredibly vivid. Up until now, unless you have an OLED display, best laptop display on the market, because it is also 120 hertz ProMotion. It can ramp up, ramp down, high refresh rate, and it looks just incredible. And near 4K. There isn't exactly 4K pixels, but it is approaching 4K, especially for that 16.2 inch. But a 4K, some manufacturers put 4K displays on 13-inch laptops, which I never really understood. I'm sure you have great pixel density, but you'd have to be like an ant in order to really distinguish the quality of the display. So the display is great. It's great for Photoshop. It's great for video editing. Incredibly accurate. There are display profiles out the wazoo, sRGB, video, photo, which is in DCI-3. And then you have that notch. My goodness. That notch is integrated now with Apple software into the menu bar. And you have complaints left and right about the menu bar, that notch obscuring items behind the menu bar. And I've actually run into that. I keep a lot of stuff in my menu bar, and I have to use Bartender to wrangle it all in. It gets in the way sometimes, but in full screen, thanks to mini LEDs, thanks to individual lit dimming zones, it really doesn't matter. And it houses that new webcam. And so it's in the design language, and negligibly, it's an interesting design choice. But for the most part, other than hiding menu bars, and maybe some mouse interactions, I think it really only adds to the experience, because that 16 by 10 aspect ratio on the MacBook there, that top part, which is the menu bar, isn't actually part of that. Isn't actually part of 16 by 10. So it is added real estate. It's added real estate so that you have more screen, raw screen materials that is not taken up by the menu bar. So now, just some statistics for the display. 1000 nits sustained brightness, super bright thanks to mini LEDs. 1600 nits peak brightness, watching HD content is a dream on Apple TV Plus and my own Dolby Vision. Videos on my photo library, it looks great. There are 10,000 mini LEDs. The more LEDs, the better. Now, This is important because OLEDs, each pixel is its own quote unquote mini LED. And so you have perfect blacks, perfect contrast, and you don't have these haloing zones. But with 10,000, there is minimal haloing, especially with the software control on this. It's present. You can see it in terrible, terrible circumstances in like perfect black on white in a dark room environment. You can see it. It's definitely there, but negligible whenever you're talking about regular working environments. 1,000,000 to 1 contrast ratio is achievable because of those mini LEDs and 1 billion colors in P3. You have great HDR performance, and Apple knocked it out of the park with its display. This is actually one of the reasons to pick it over the MacBook Air. It's leaps and bounds over other comparison laptops. And so the only way to beat this, as I'm aware, in the Windows laptop is first of all to have high refresh rate and high response times or low response times, which I think I tested it at like 10 milliseconds of response time. It actually isn't very good, despite having high refresh rate. But you have to implement a really good OLED display in order to compete with this. And so I think that this is going to be competitive for a long time, and the display looks just incredible. It's a beauty to look at. That's why I use it every day instead of other devices. And so this is, of course, technology derived from the iPad Pro, which actually had these specifications before, but it looks great on MacBook. Sharp. All right. Enough fondling over the display. Let's move on to performance. Now, we've talked about performance in terms of Apple's charts, which can be deceptive at times, and it wants to tell a story, and it wants to derive a story. Now, despite studying lots of statistics in undergraduate, I'm not a PC tester. And so I want to take this segment of performance to real life performance. What does it actually do? What kind of tangible performance can you get with that? Because I doubt anyone will care about 1 or 2 minutes or 10 minutes even faster rendering performance, right? In terms of empirical, observable data, what does it mean? And we've already taken a look at some numbers, right? Even though it's maybe slightly skewed in Apple's favor. Let's look at coding. So in Xcode, these compile times are incredible. Even from Intel to M1, the compile times like 2-3 times faster. You're maybe going to get another 2 times faster in compile times thanks to the unified memory on this. VS Code, now coding on a server, which is usually what I do, coding on a remote server. Now, the compiling is already done out in the cloud, but if you do it natively, it's really good. The emulators, you can start like 3 or 4 of them at a time without a slip in performance. Running machine learning models and teaching. It's a very highly efficient. It's a very good experience. Probably nothing you couldn't do on the M1. Let's be honest. But if you are an app developer, especially an Apple app developer that is needing to run on these app store cycles and release cycles, time is of the essence. You pay for time with your money, then I think it's absolutely worth it, especially the M1 Pro, which, coming back into silicon for a moment, and purchasing decisions at the very end, it really dictates what kind of M1 or M1 Pro or M1 Max, depending on which chip you want to get. Now, for gaming, here's where I go on my big gaming rant, all right? And you've heard me say this before. Gaming on Mac really frustrates me because I come from the PC world where you have DirectX, you have Vulkan APIs, you have great game developing tools, and it runs fluidly, it runs smoothly, it runs super seamlessly through Steam, through Epic Game Stores, through whatever you want to play. It's gaming paradise in Windows. But in macOS, it is rather, if not a gaming purgatory, a gaming hell, because you are coding through the Metal Mac API, which is indeed a high performance developer platform, but it really just isn't conducive to games that were built on DirectX, built in Unity, built in what's the Epic Games one? Unreal Engine. So you can develop games here. It does well with 3D models, but really Blender has a ways to go if you are 3D modeling. Really the performance of Unity and Unreal Engine has a ways to go, and actually running it, packaging it on the laptop, there is a lot of performance to be had. I don't know why, even with the included CPU and GPU, the improved performance, the Mac experience has been mediocre. I can barely get 60 frames on some. You can't, and the low response time of the screen, it's impossible to turn this into a gaming experience similar to, trust me, I've tried, even with Apple Arcade, some of the most optimized games for Mac. You can't really turn it into an experience like you do on Windows. It's just that missing smoothness, that missing responsiveness, and that missing sharpness. My goodness, these games are struggling to render in sharp and beautiful details, especially for something like Rise of the Tomb Raider. Like, you would expect that game to look absolutely beautiful. It looks jagged. It looks ugly. It's impressive because it's running through Rosetta, which is a translation x86 to ARM translation layer, which is accelerated by x86 accelerators in M1, which is part of the reason the performance is so good. But yes, really just a disappointment. And what Apple really needs to do is, first of all, the hardware is there. I actually believe the hardware is there based off of the performance numbers. But they could do with some hardware upgrades. But specifically, it's a lost in translation thing. They can't communicate. The games layer and development can't communicate in the same language. DirectX support, Vulkan support, I know it's out there because Apple is committed to Metal, something that they did, but Metal's limited, and games are definitely not going to be supported for Metal. And so they either need to improve Metal, which they are in macOS Ventura. I don't know what it means for games. Metal 3 is released. But I'm really hoping to see high-performance games make their way onto the Mac as a possibility. But that's what's always constrained it for me. I can't play games like Rainbow Six Siege. Can't play games like Valorant on the Mac. And so that's my games rant. And there's a lot more to be said. But suffice it to say that games is a disappointment in terms of performance here. Don't buy this for games. Please don't buy any Mac for games. You'd be better off with a console or a Windows PC. This is music making. I believe this is Logic Pro. Either that or, yeah, it looks very Logic Pro-y to me. I've done a lot of work in GarageBand in terms of audio processing for podcasts and making and doing singing and instrument compression, etc. A really good audio tool, all in all, but you're never going to run into a performance bottleneck if you're doing it casually. If you're doing it professionally, these MacBook Pros are the go-to standard for having all your plugins and compression chains put in and operational. Most of the plugins have already converted over to M1. If not, they run well on Rosetta. And if you use really niche extensions and compression tools, then and normalization tools, that is, either might be time for you to switch to a tool that does something very similar, because the Apple transition itself is almost complete, only with the Mac Pro left, and we're already at M2. But the music creation ecosystem and platform has been alive and well on the Mac, and so you are not going to struggle in terms of music if you're a music producer. And with Logic Pro, it's just the performance doesn't get any better. So you've talked about coding, we talked about gaming, which is non-existent, we talked about music. Now let's go on to something like video editing, like coloring. If you're on Final Cut, even if you're on DaVinci Resolve, which is in many cases rivaling the performance of Final Cut now, video editing has often been the forte of MacBooks. That's why people buy them. People buy them for Photoshop performance, Illustrator performance. Premiere is, I believe, out of beta, and there is now a full-fledged version of operational Premiere. Really, really great performance on there. DaVinci Resolve, Final Cut. I'm not sure about Avid. I'm not an Avid user, but there is just great performance left and right because of these highly optimized subroutines and highly optimized performance ProRes encoders, video decoders, H.265 encoders and decoders. Really great performance for coloring, for display, for special effects, for titles, all throughout the the video editing experience. And export times are out. It's just like in and out. I can export something in 20 minutes, complex timeline, maybe in like half that time. It's faster than 1-to-1. So yes, traditionally, this is if you produce something for YouTube, like complex, that tends to attract these media publications and YouTube channels doing reviews. Of course, they're going to be talking about video editing. It's no surprise that it's fast, and Apple really knows what they're doing in terms of focusing on video editing to tout the performance of it. But in terms of everyday use, in terms of things like coding, gaming, even music creation, there is a much more realistic view that the Mac doesn't have such an upper hand as it did and as it does with video editing in comparison to any other laptop. Just know that it does it much more efficiently than other laptops. It does it at a similar performance rate at this point, but it does it much more efficiently, makes less noise. Now, the M1 Max here is considerably louder than, especially on the 14-inch. The M1 Max and 14 inches are like helicopter fans. Nowhere near as bad as, say, something like an XPS with an i9 in it, but it does make audible noise. But the M1 Pro, a lot quieter from what I've read. But everyday performance, browsing, and, for example, when I'm making manuscripts, when I'm looking at patient documents, when I'm looking at retinal scans or coding, it flies straight through. It doesn't make a fuss. With the basic audio editing that I do, doesn't make a fuss either. Barely raises the CPU. Gaming, let's not talk about that anymore. And video editing, especially that I'm involved in, it just really, especially for sound design. I think I'm working on a project right now that has some simple like ambience and Foley. It really is and I totally forgot to talk about the high impedance headphone jack, which we'll get back to that later. Anyway, I digress. That encompasses maybe 80 to 90% of usage of why you would want to buy one of these M1 Pros, M1 MacBook Pros, M1 Pro and M1 Max, M1 MacBook, M1 Pro, MacBook Pro, M1 Max, MacBook Pro, 14 or 16 inch. So you got that nice display, looks beautiful. You got the extended high efficiency performance of the M1 Silicon, Apple Silicon, and you have the ecosystem Mac OS just being in many ways superior for creative vision. Photoshop is just, doesn't miss a beat. I'm in Infinity. It does lag from time to time with Infinity, but I think that is an Infinity sans serif problem. But things like Pixelmator Pro, which uses ML, that Apple advantage is really showing here whenever it can flex its muscles. Otherwise, get an M1. I mean, you're going to be served by something like 18, 19 hours of battery life on regular usage. Typing out documents, manuscripts, looking at pictures, watching videos. It is just insane, the type of performance that we're talking about here. That, yes, is only now being achieved by Windows laptops, by, for example, the new Dell XPS 13 Plus. But really, the Mac here paved the way forward and really took advantage of that first to market on it. And then they did really well. And that, of course, came out of the lineage and the heritage of the iPads and iPhones. So, now that we've talked about tangible performance, let's talk about the peripherals that I said that we would get back to. The keyboard is really nice to type on. Again, I said it has a superior backlight, and it gets oily pretty fast. But I think you would expect that for most laptops, especially whenever I was running with a Dell XPS, and especially the HP Spectre. You would get I think there's some oleophobic coating on this MacBook. I mean, there has to be. But you rub it off pretty well in a couple of weeks. Where in the Spectre lineup, HP Spectre, the one that I had, it just got super fingerprinty and oily super fast to the point where a few months in, I didn't even want to use my keyboard anymore. The Dell XPS in it itself, it has a good keyboard, but a weak backlight and just horrible key stability. So that way the keys started just falling off. And so yeah. We're talking about an S-class masterclass in this keyboard, and especially with the contrasting letters. I think that Blackwell was a beautiful design choice, and the fingerprint reader works fast. The arrow keys are right where they're supposed to be. The escape key is big and pronounced. Great for coding, great for manuscript writing, and things of the sort. Next, the speaker. The speaker is really incredible for its sound. Beats the M2 MacBook Air and MacBook Pro, 13-inch MacBook Pro by a country mile. Room-filling sound. Now, I'm not an audio snob. I think unlike screens and unlike performance where I really scrutinize the specifics, audio, I'm not so much. I just give me a 10 speaker and I'll be fine. As long as I can hear what they're saying or hear the music, I don't care if it's clicking going on. I'm much less inclined audio, and that's something that I hope to fix. Finding new audio subsystems and audiophile toys that I can get to play with. Let's just say that it's really bassy, it's punchy, it's clear at high volumes. The 16-inch more so than the 14-inch, but the 14-inch still is absolutely size-defying. The way that the speakers are arranged, I think it's a 6-speaker system so that it can imitate a spatial audio surround sound mix, especially if you're listening to music and watching videos and movies on this thing. It's a great, fantastic experience if you're listening to it head on. The trackpad is big and expansive. Again, the industry trend set by 2016 MacBook Pros. Force touch trackpad. Really, Apple has mastered this, and they haven't changed it in the past 12 years. Not much, anyway, or 10 to 12 years. And so by introducing this Force Touch trackpad, new gestures, the coding on it is phenomenal. Pressure on it is really good, and I would have no problems just using this every day. In fact, I liked it so much that I bought the new standalone trackpad. The Magic Trackpad, which it's based off of, works wonderfully. I use it sometimes to video edit it and scroll the timeline, and audio edit and scroll the timeline, and web browse in order to have smoother scroll instead of my Logitech MX Master 3. And so there you have the just fantastic performance of the trackpad. All is good, and so you have the great trackpad and keyboard combination. HP keyboards for me really don't do it. I don't think they're clicky enough. Lenovo ones are actually the ones that rival the MacBook pretty much. The Dell XPS is good. The typing experience is good, but not as good as the MacBook. And the Dell trackpad is horrible. Depending on the model, of course, but they have the diving mechanism still. And I would get like ghost clicks, and the trackpad would just not work because it wasn't tightened in tension well enough. And they've been still struggling with that problem even several generations in, which is why I abandoned it as my main work laptop for the time being, in addition to it being louder than a jet engine. Let's just say that the overall complement of speaker, keyboard, and trackpad is very well done. Now we have the 1080p webcam, which I did spell right. Man, that was a mess of a slide earlier. It is good. The sensor itself is actually not that big, and it is still clearly a webcam. But this webcam is special because it's supported by silicon features. And what I mean by that is that the Apple Silicon, the M1, has technologies and has the heritage and DNA of, as you remember, the iPhone and the iPad, which now with the rise of computational technology, you have things like HDR, you have things like portrait mode, you have things like center stage, which this one doesn't have center stage, but on the iPads you have center stage, which is computationally powered. The power of silicon pushing the sensor beyond its physical space and beyond the bits that it can provide. And so you have some of those same advantages here. The 1080p webcam is doing facial processing, background and lighting processing. It has a portrait mode, actually a much rather natural one than ones that Microsoft Teams or Zoom provides. And it looks all right. It looks okay for 1080p. Now, no one does a good webcam in my opinion, except for the Microsoft Surface Line. But if Microsoft Surface Line is S tier, then Apple MacBook is maybe A tier, and the rest of it's F tier. If I'm being completely honest with you. And with this 1080p webcam, I don't think I had a slide for this, but the 3-speaker array is also very good. Sometimes you can even podcast with it. I use it raw. I have my Blue Yeti hooked up to my Mac Mini, which doesn't have a microphone, but I will use the microphone raw on the MacBook Pro in addition to its webcam. And it's a nice studio setup. Moving on, we have the speakers, which we've already talked about, but it does a kind of a faux spatial audio sound. And using computational audio, it will kind of convince you that there are speakers around you. And it does a pretty good job, especially on the 16-inch. So let's talk about ecosystem. And I have one slide on this because I think that a lot of people misunderstand the Apple ecosystem. And I'm gonna park out right here and talk about this. A lot of people misunderstand the Apple ecosystem because they haven't used it yet. They don't understand the context in which these features are available and made to the consumers who buy Apple. So the Apple experience, the ecosystem, is like a walled garden. Really high walls, really hard to get out of, but inside of the garden, it's really lush, it's green, it has everything you'd ever want in it. And that is the features that the people are paying for, that buy Apple, including me, that we are paying for. We're giving them that Apple tax so that we can come to depend on these continuity features, on these ecosystem features. And so in isolation, the MacBook Pro is a great laptop, but it is boosted by all of these features that macOS has and can connect to your phone, can connect to your iPad. And really, these features appeal to everyday consumers. They do. They really do. And there's nothing like it on, and maybe Samsung has some things, but there's really nothing like it in terms of speed and efficiency and execution outside of the Mac OS, iOS, iPadOS market. Truly, there isn't. Let's start off with macOS Monterey for a minute. And the M1 Pro and M1 Max MacBooks ship with macOS Monterey, and it's a really capable operating system in and of itself. It has all the things that you'd ever want on it, and you could probably do everything but gaming. And so iCloud is the central feature here. That is the core. And so if you have iCloud on your phone, iCloud on your iPad, iCloud on your Apple TV and your watch, whatever, everything, all of your information comes onto the macOS, and it really, it works. It just has all of the information that it needs, and it moves into the computer for you. I don't know if you've ever moved before. I've moved several times, out in and out from houses, in and out from dorms and apartments. Like, just having a moving crew just move all the stuff for you. That'd be so nice. and that's what iCloud does. And that's what the iCloud ecosystem does. It takes all of your personal information that you stored with Apple, and once you get a new device and once you get a new experience, it just ships it right all in, and it's ready for you to use. That's the advantage. That's the main advantage of iCloud, in addition to their privacy pitch, in addition to all their other features. FaceTime. FaceTime is huge because you don't have to use Google Duo. You don't have to do it through Google. And a lot of people say, like, man, what's so special about FaceTime that I literally couldn't do with any other video conferencing device, that I couldn't do with Zoom, that I couldn't do with Google Duo? It's because FaceTime is closely integrated into the phone feature of the iPhone. And so it's connected with your phone number along with your iCloud account. So it's not through an email. It's connected to through your feature, and it's treated as a system feature instead of an app on the iPhone. And so yes, there is an app, but it's all interconnected. And so it's really easy to switch from audio call to an audio FaceTime call to a video FaceTime call, which FaceTime has group features now. It has all the bells and whistles that if you have an iPhone, then you could use FaceTime in order to, number one, get high definition video with the high performance cameras on Apple devices, and audio and video processing, and all of that comes with it. It's simple to use. It's dead simple. It's available, which a lot of people dismiss the notion that just the pure availability of it makes it convenient. And that's something that Google Duo now and other streaming and other video messaging services are now catching up to. It is convenient. It is available. It is there. It has all the creature comforts it wants, and it is dead simple to use. You call and you see the other person on the other side, and when you're done, you hang up. That's that's all that it is. And now, with continuity, which we'll talk about later, FaceTime can go from your phone in the new macOS Ventura and iOS 16. It can go from your phone to your watch. You can answer it in the same call. Now, you can't do FaceTime on your watch, definitely not, but you can convert it to a call and then convert it to your Mac, which then now uses your Mac computer. And then if you're planning to do something with your computer, you can put your loved one or your friends up on the screen, and you can come see them while working on your computer, and then go do it on your iPad. You can accept these calls from any of your devices. Really, that kind of interconnectedness, availability, and simplicity makes FaceTime just dead simple to use, easily available, and really a standout feature. And that's why we like FaceTime, and because it's interconnected and not treated as a separate app or service like Duo is. It just feels like it's there, even though it has its own branding, and yes, it is its own service. FaceTime was revolutionary. Came before anything else. Now, iMessage is another one that I have a hard time justifying to people, because people outside the United States that don't use iPhones, like, why would you use iMessage and voluntarily lock yourself in? But the thing about iMessage is that it has the creature comforts of WhatsApp. So if you use WhatsApp or if you use Telegram, and Messenger, of course it has different features than SMS, which is highly limited in this case. And the thing to understand is that the United States telecom industry is relatively sluggish and slow moving in terms of adopting technology, like RCS, rich communication services. SMS, we're still on SMS, the simple messaging, and it appears as a green bubble inside of your iPhone, your Mac, your iPad. And not only does that green bubble look kind of ugly, and that's kind of the stigma that has been placed around it, but iMessage allows a lot more features to come into the messaging experience that SMS hasn't yet, and RCS hasn't yet. For example, typing indicators, read receipts. Now with the new iOS 16, edit messages, unsend messages. You are able to send pictures at high maximum resolution, videos at high maximum resolution. Your iMessages are end-to-end encrypted, and you can switch easily to FaceTime. Your links, your photos, your messages, all linked through iCloud, and you can go from texting your friend on your phone to typing out a paragraph on iMessage. And of course, there's a character limit on SMS, if I recall correctly, but not one on iMessage. For your iPad to your Mac, and it's freely available because huge market, again, in the United States. Everybody has iMessage. It's freely available to them. So if you have an iPhone and it's freely available to you, seamlessly interconnected, just the same way as FaceTime is interconnected with the phone call itself, iMessage is interconnected and associated with your phone number in a way that is similar to that, except this time with SMS. And so that's why we use iMessage. And again, syncs with iCloud. It has iCloud integration and sharing. iMessage, a big one for me for iMessage is, first of all, I don't need to trust Facebook or whatever other message apps that I might want. But the biggest one for me, of course, is Apple integration, including music, including Apple TV, including stickers. There's a whole ecosystem in that. A lot of people use iMessage. Typing indicators is a big one for me. Read indicators is a big one for me. And high resolution images, audio files, and video files. That's the big one for me, because when my mom sends me videos, right? So most of my family's on iPhone, but I have an aunt who uses an Android phone, and she likes to take pictures, and I really appreciate that. But when she sends it to me over SMS, they're compressed because of the sheer size of her Samsung, which takes really good photos. But they're compressed because SMS can't deliver that much storage. And so, of course, then you go through all the trouble of uploading to Google Drive. It's a hassle, blah, blah, blah. And something I miss on here is AirDrop. And AirDrop is so unbelievably useful. when you don't want to text somebody, you just want that photo to show up on their photo album, show up on their files, or you want to transfer a huge batch of photos that you just took onto your computer, you just airdrop it, and there's no fuss. That's the key. There's no fuss, and it's just there where you want it. Where the process for on an Android phone, whenever I use my Android phone and my Windows laptop, is that on my Android phone, I either email it or I upload it to Google Drive, and then I log into Google Drive on my phone, and then I download it. And then I have to clear it from my Google Drive because I don't want that storage taking up, and I pay for storage for Google. I don't want that storage being taken up. And so the process is a lot more complicated, and you have to copy files over, where AirDrop is just a simple click, and it's freely available, and peer-to-peer connection. It's fast, ad hoc connection, really just wonderful. And that AirDrop is you can send anything with it: contacts, photos, videos, etc. And I'm not even through this list yet. So let's zoom through this list. Apple Mail, right? All of the messages and preferences that you have. Mail is available on all devices. Now I use MimeStream, of course, which is a Gmail optimized app on Mac. But all of your mail is interconnected, all of your photos, your whole photo library follows you with you. And you're like, well, why can't you use, Google Photos with that? Well, my problem with Google Photos is, first of all, Google. And not to say that I don't use Google services. I actually use almost every Google service in conjunction with Apple services. Actually, I upload my whole photo library into Google Photos. I'm actually paying for Google Photos. Where, by the way, uploading it to a cloud, they're not keeping my original files. They're actually compressing it slightly to where they think I won't notice, but I don't get the full resolution. It's just high quality uploads into the cloud. But yes, giving the information to Google, which is sometimes nice because the facial recognition system is pretty good. But anyway, I digress. Google Photos, taking the photos and compressing it and then doing whatever they do with it. I just like to have photos here, iCloud Photos, full high resolution. The app is literally meant to be as simple as possible, interconnected with the camera, which on Android, it's a confusing mess depending on what it is, because on one side, you may have Photos, and then you have the Gallery app, and then you have the Google Photos app, and then on others, you have just the Google Photos app as the Photos app, and then you have your own gallery. It's complicated. It's a little bit confusing. Where on Apple, it's just camera, it's just photos, and it connects through all of your devices, and all of your photos are readily available and on system. That's another thing that I struggle with, because if you're using a Windows device, you have to go log onto the website and download the picture from the website, save it to your folder, and then point whatever service you're using to that folder. And and you're like, Justin, man, you're complaining. You're pissed off for no reason because you have to click an extra button. But trust me, it saves time, it saves convenience, and these photos are treated as a system level feature as opposed to a web service. And now, if I took a picture on my phone and I want to set it as my wallpaper, I can either AirDrop it, which is simple, or I can just open my my iCloud Photos, which is the Photos app you see on the Mac right there on the dock, and just set it. Like, it's treated as, hey, this photo belongs to this Mac as much as it does to the iPhone, and that's the beauty of iCloud. Calendar, all of my calendar events sync up. I'm a big calendar user. All my notes sync up. Now, Notes is a little less important to me because I think that Apple Notes has a long way to go before catching up with me. Like, I use Obsidian, I use Drafts, and they all connect via iCloud. And so still, it's a testament to how useful iCloud is between all of your Macs. But if you're taking a scan or a document or some quick thought on Apple Notes, it's there. It's freely available. Reminders is something that I didn't put in there. I'm a big Apple Reminders user. It, again, syncs everything. And of course, there is features and there are apps that can replicate this and use the web in order to sync through all of it. But it's not as simple or not as fully integrated into the Apple ecosystem. For example, the reminders, I can attach, first of all, a reminder that will remind me across any device, but also if I'm messaging someone, the reminders will message me in context of that messaging. So if I'm messaging my brother and I need to tell him that the quarterly tax reports are done for the business, then I I can say, well, next time I'm texting him, just remind me that. And then that night I get on my phone, I text it, and then the reminder says, hey, remind him about the tax reports. And then I can do that. Things like syncing with calendar, iCloud, Place. That's just another advantage of reminders because it's so deeply integrated into the Apple ecosystem. And by design, I'm fully aware of this. I'm fully aware that as an Apple sheep, I am eating the, what do they call it? I'm drinking the juice, drinking the Kool-Aid. And I'm just saying that as it is, and as apparent as it is, the MacBook Pro, and we've digressed a long way from the actual hardware itself. This experience is just as much as it is as handling the laptop itself. Moving on, podcasts. All your podcasts are synced. You have the iWork library, which is free, unlike Microsoft Word, and pre-installed, unlike Microsoft Office, and and doesn't need a subscription, and it's dead simple. And I think that if you were to come onto Mac and use the iWork suite, which is Pages, Numbers, and Keynote, which is what I made this presentation in, I think you'd really come to appreciate it. And all the collaboration features coming in macOS Ventura will really push it towards being more competitive. Contacts. I keep all my contacts in my iCloud, and it's really nice to say, I have a friend who is who travels the country, and she does like content, like pageantry contests. And so the other day I was looking for some information about her, and I was like, hey, I don't have her number, and I was on my iPad, and so I was like, open the contacts app. Okay, there's her number, and then I sent it to whichever contact that I was doing. And so it's nice that I don't have to reach into my phone and share it like that. I can just send the whole contact card through iCloud, and then all of a sudden I have a photo connected with it, and numbers and emails and works and notes. It really is a nice and convenient thing. Contacts, your contacts database. Follows you wherever you go. And this is part of continuity. This is what continuity is, a specific set of features that Apple has implemented in order for you to go in real time between devices. For example, if I was working on this presentation on my iPad at my breakfast dining table, and I was eating breakfast, and then I walked upstairs into my office where I continued it on the Mac, and a little bar would pop up on the side of my dock and said, hey, just resume where you left off. And I clicked it, and then everything was ready for me. Everything was ready for me. And this differs from cloud services and live updating is because I don't have to open anything. It suggests to me that, hey, open Keynote right now, and I'll just place you back wherever you were. You can go from, and you can switch FaceTime's doing this. It's not only Keynote, but Safari tabs, Mail. You can even from, I was texting someone on my watch the other day, and then I wanted to come onto my Mac to resume it because it wasn't the dictation was doing something funny. And so I had the messages open on my watch, and on my sidebar right there, it said open messages, and then the icon on the top right corner had a little watch on it. And it recognizes that I was doing something on my watch. I can click it, and then it opened messages. Really beautiful, really, really great continuity thing. And with continuity comes universal control, which means that you can use one set of keyboard in order to control any device, specifically the iPad and the Mac. And so what I can do is I can take the cursor on my MacBook Pro, and I push it off the screen, and then it gets transferred to my iPad. And then now the iPad, it's not a secondary screen, it's still the iPad, but in this case, it is being controlled wirelessly with my keyboard, with my mouse on my Mac, but still in its iPad state. And you can kind of think about this. There are features like, I think it's Logitech Flow or Synergy. If you're familiar with those, you can move from device to device with one keyboard with, I think it's QVM feature, which is it forms an ad hoc connection and and securely transmits the data from one device to another. Now, I'm speaking out of my depth there on that one, but I know it's secure. And in addition to universal control, you can just straight up use the iPad as a monitor using Sidecar. And so there's a feature, boom, you said, hey, we detect an iPad, and it literally becomes a secondary Mac monitor, which you can, which has a touch bar on the bottom integrated with it. You can use Apple Pencil with a Mac. You can do it wirelessly or with a wire. Very convenient if you have two Apple devices. Just another screen to work with. For me personally, it's more at the bottom of the list, but Apple Music. It's so nice to have one music library all synced up. I'm paying for one Apple Music plan, and I can listen to whatever album I want on my Mac, and it all syncs up pretty consistently. And with HomePod and with Apple TV, this is on another level, because Apple Music is, of course, integrated into Apple stuff in a way that Spotify can never. Well, actually, I take that back. Spotify has a feature where you can actually resume if you are on a web player or a native desktop client or an Amazon Alexa. You can switch it through the power of the interwebs and play on any device you wish, as long as Spotify is available. And that is that is a win for Spotify in my book. You can only AirPlay music, and you can AirPlay music and movies onto other Mac devices. You just can't do it with any other device. And so, like, I got an Apple TV the other day. It's super nice. And one of the advantages is that I logged into my iCloud, and then all of a sudden it was working with my phone. I can use my phone as a remote. All my photos came onto my phone, onto my TV. All of my podcasts, all of my music came onto their TV shows, movies, all of the streaming apps. Like, I was like, man, I have a long password for my Amazon Prime account. Like, what am I going to do? And then the Apple TV says, hey, all you have to do, you don't have to type it onto the on-screen prompt. If you wanted to, you can use a keyboard on your on your phone in order to do it. But all you have to do is just open the Prime app. I open the Prime app and it says, hey, there's a Apple TV looking for verification. You want to log in? I'm like, yep. And then Apple TV logs in. Beauty of iCloud, beauty of continuity, and focus modes, which are like custom do not disturb modes, like filters for your device, and I use them all the time. So that means that if I activate a focus on one device, a focus mode on one device, the rest of the focus modes activate on the rest of the devices. That means that only contacts I let through or only contacts I block won't get through, and it will adjust accordingly, run any automations. Extremely useful, and Mac only. So I've talked enough about ecosystem, and you're probably bored out of your mind. So the conclusion is that these new Apple MacBook Pros, of course, they come in space gray and come in silver. Beautiful industrial design, great keyboard, great trackpad, incredible speakers, has a little weird notch, but in the middle of a huge, great expansive display, decent webcam, great mics, and the return of ports is highly praised. Now, the HDMI port, I failed to mention this, I think it's 2.0, not 2.1, so you're going to have trouble running at higher resolutions and higher frame rates, and the SD card slot is not the newest standard. It is just the previous standard, so it's a little bit slower. You can't use the newer SD cards with it. But regardless, MagSafe is a great addition. Thunderbolt 4 from Thunderbolt 3 coming on, and the headphone jack, I forgot to mention, is this shows the lack of my audio knowledge, but I think it is let me look this up because I don't want to get this wrong. It is it's what's known as a I think it's a high impedance headphone jack, which means that you can drive higher impedance headphones, so that more volume, more clarity of sound. And so it's not just a regular headphone jack. It's got the drivers behind it in order to push higher powered headphones. That's something that you usually have to go out and buy. And so it may not be as good as, dedicated drivers and amps, but it definitely is nice touch for this professional laptop. So now we got to think about pricing. This is a 14-inch. It starts at $2,000. I've actually seen it on Amazon drop up to $1,700, which is still very expensive, which is still an investment for a couple of years, I would definitely imagine. But for the M1 Pro, for 8-core CPU, 14-core GPU, 16 gigs of memory, and 512 SSD, 512 gigabyte SSD. I think that you're paying a little bit of an Apple tax, but it's fairly competitive for what's on the market right now. Just have a look. Dell XPSs, the HP Spectres, the Lenovo laptops, and others of the type. You are giving up upgradability, so buy as much storage and RAM as you need now. You are giving up access to your hardware. Everything's soldered on and on the chip for a streamlined experience. If you like to upgrade, and if you want an upgrade path down the line, and you want to buy a laptop for cheap, you're definitely looking for a MacBook. You're definitely not in the audience. But if you don't know how to open a laptop, and I tell you, where's this SODIMM slot, and you can't point that out to me, then, well, it doesn't really matter to you. And I think that a MacBook is a great opportunity, especially with the compromises it makes. Even though everything is all in one system and a chip, it compensates for that for great support, world-class service support. You can bring it into Apple Store. You can call Apple support line. They have world-class customer service. And of course, they'll usually either do it for you for free for the price that you charged up front, or they'll charge you some outrageous amount. Depends on the Apple care. Anyway, they're a business. They're all about making business. Not saying Apple's perfect by any means, but that is the way that it stands, the compromises that it makes at the moment. $19.99. That's what I brought it for. $19.99 I think is an appropriate compromise. I think it's appropriate price, especially for that screen and speaker system that you're getting. Best in class. You can buy this knowing that you are getting best in class hardware and software. And with all the advantages of the ecosystem, if you're already in Apple, you already know that every dollar you pay towards buying a new Apple device is going to be bolstered by the suite of features that it is compatible with your other Apple devices. So if you want the fully fledged M1 Pro, it's and a 1 terabyte SSD, it's another $500, which outrageous, yes, at this price. But again, it's an investment for professional machine. If you're looking for something a little bit more on the consumer side, look at M1, starting at $1,000. And Mac Mini is like $500 at this point. That was my first M1 Mac. And then you can upgrade it, spec it up to M1 Max, the 16-core or the 10-core, 32-core GPU variant. Almost at $3,000, I believe, for the 14-inch. And the 16-inch, of course, you're paying out the nose. $2,500 for the basic M1, $2,600 if you want more storage, and fully spec'd out. Now, well, actually, this is not even fully spec'd out. 32 gigs of RAM, you're paying $3,500, and surely almost $5,000 for like 2-3 terabytes and 64 gigabytes of unified memory. It's expensive. It is expensive, but you are getting what you paid for. So, in conclusion, who buys this laptop? Professionals who depend on macOS in order to support their livelihood. Prosumers who really just can't afford it and just like nice hardware. If you are video editing, if you are 3D rendering, coding, then this is a machine that you probably would like to have for a lifetime. Or excuse me, not a lifetime, that's silly. For a long time is what I meant. It is an investment. It is a rather nice one. It is probably the best laptop that Apple has put out in the past 10 years. Great screen, great trackpad, keyboard, all that I mentioned, and great functionality with the ecosystem, especially with how central Mac is in the whole Apple paradigm. And definitely looking at over Windows machines if you are willing to switch, if you are on iPhone. But yes, other than that, you don't video edit, you don't make music, you don't code for a living. I think the M1 and M2 offerings a little lower down in the Mac are definitely worth it at this time, especially with the power efficiency, with the battery life. Actually, I failed to talk about the battery life. This is actually so silly of me, but you're getting 15 to 16 hours. Great battery life on the MacBook Pro. Huge batteries they're putting in there due to the new thickness. Great battery life, less heat, a proper sleep mode, unlike Windows. There's a lot of things to talk about. But that is my deep dive. That is my conclusion. If you're everyone else, consider either a lower end M1 or M2 MacBook or an iPad, even cheaper. But at this point, I think that the only reason that you would want to buy a Windows machine at below $1,000 is gaming. Number one, there are great gaming notebooks and gaming laptops under $1,000. Upgradability. You want a machine that is as cheap as possible and has the capacity to upgrade and follow you for a long time. You don't care about the hardware. You don't even care about the software. You just want a laptop, and you don't care about the experience. You just want something that works. And laptops that are really good at one thing and compromising at the rest, where the Macs are really just the overall package, depending on who you want to buy it for. It's a great investment, in my opinion. Apple sheep, yeah, okay. Well, I've had my fair share of laptops, and you know who you are. You know who, and I sound like an Apple apologist now because you understand your use cases, and if it would be better fit by $200, $300 Windows laptop, which is going to cause you some problems and headaches, and if you're willing to sit down and be patient, which at one point I was, then that would be the best purchase for you. But having used laptops from $200, $300 all the way to upwards of $3,000 for laptops, and I've used a wide variety of Windows laptops, I think that the Mac is still a really great option and a really great package. So thank you for listening to my TED Talk. Oh my goodness, it's been quite a little bit. So that's it. I'm signing off for now. If you have any questions, of course, comments, DMs, any way available to get me, and I will try my best to do it. So, all right. Thank you very much.